A young billionaire is dared by his college buddy to pretend to be homeless for a week. He accepts, seeing it as a trivial challenge, but meets Emily, a dedicated social worker who shows him the harsh realities of life on the streets. He begins using his wealth to fund shelters, attracted by her passion and sincerity, but she harbors a secret agenda that could change everything. The clink of glasses and the murmur of high society filled the grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton in downtown Manhattan. Charles Easton, a 30-year-old billionaire and tech mogul, was the center of attention, regaling a group of Manhattan's elite with tales of his latest venture's success. His sister, Victoria, watched from a distance, her expression a mix of admiration and concern. As the applause died down and the guests dispersed for another round of cocktails, Victoria approached Charles, her heels clicking assertively on the marble floor. "Impressive speech, Charles. But don't you think it's all a bit detached from reality?" Charles chuckled, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "Detached? We're building realities, Victoria, virtual ones that will revolutionize how people interact." Victoria raised an eyebrow, her tone turning serious. "When was the last time you interacted with the real world, Charles? Not the sanitized version we live in, but the real, gritty world out there." Sensing a challenge, Charles leaned in, his curiosity piqued. "What are you getting at?" "I dare you," Victoria said, her voice low, "to live as a homeless person for 1 week. No access to your funds, your contacts, or your identity. If you're so sure about realities, let's see you handle one that's not virtual." Charles stared at her, the amusement fading from his eyes. After a moment, his competitive edge took over. "You're on. But when I win, you're donating a hefty sum to the charity of my choice." "Deal," Victoria replied, knowing she had just set in motion something neither of them could fully predict. In the days following the challenge, Charles' luxurious penthouse felt more like a war room. He researched homelessness, his brows furrowing as he scrolled through statistics and articles. The numbers were staggering, the stories heartbreaking. Yet, for Charles, it still felt like a distant reality, something he could step in and out of at will. He packed a small backpack with essentials, as advised by an online survival guide for the homeless: basic toiletries, a few layers of clothing, and a sleeping bag, all items he'd bought anonymously online. Charles tried to imagine what it would be like to sleep on the streets, but his comfortable, king-sized bed mocked the very idea. The night before the challenge, Victoria visited him. She found him in his study, surrounded by maps and notes. "You know this isn't a game, right?" Victoria said, looking around at the preparation that seemed more suited to a camping trip than survival on the streets. Charles smiled, a hint of nerves behind his confident facade. "I know, but I'm not one to back down from a challenge. How hard can it be?" Victoria sighed, hoping the experience would teach him the humility he sorely needed. "Just remember, it's not about surviving with less. It's about understanding those who have no choice." With that, she left him to his final preparations, the weight of the impending week heavy in the air. The morning of the challenge dawned clear and cool, a typical brisk autumn day in New York City. Victoria drove Charles to a less frequented part of the city, where buildings were dilapidated and the streets were littered with refuse and the occasional clatter of a stray can. The luxury of his usual Manhattan views felt worlds away. Charles, dressed in nondescript, worn clothing, felt the backpack heavy on his shoulders as he stepped out of the car. Victoria looked at him, a complex mix of worry and resolve in her eyes. "Remember, no contact unless it's an emergency. I'll be watching, but from a distance." He nodded, trying to muster a grin. "See you in a week, Vic." As she drove away, the reality of his situation began to sink in. The street was busy with people who moved with a purpose he couldn't quite understand. He was an outsider here, invisible yet conspicuously out of place. Charles walked aimlessly for a while, trying to get his bearings, feeling every gaze that slid past him, intentionally avoiding his eyes. He found a park bench that seemed as good a place as any to start. Sitting down, he watched the world go by, the chill of the metal seeping through his thin jacket. He realized he had no plan for what came next. Hunger was not yet an issue, but it would become one, and finding a safe place to sleep was a priority he hadn't truly planned for. The adventure he had envisioned was nowhere to be found in the anxious tightening of his stomach. As the sun set, the temperature dropped, and Charles felt the cold seep into his bones. He hadn't eaten since breakfast, and the initial adrenaline had long worn off, replaced by a gnawing hunger and a growing sense of dread. He wandered into a part of the city where the buildings crowded closer together, shadows pooling in the narrow alleys. The noises of the city seemed louder here, the occasional shout or burst of laughter echoing off the concrete, making him jump. He found a spot behind a dumpster, not ideal, but out of the wind. He unrolled his sleeping bag with trembling hands, the sounds of the city a constant murmur in the background. Laying there, Charles stared up at a sliver of sky between the towering buildings. The stars were obscured by the city's light pollution, leaving him enveloped in a glow that offered no warmth. Every noise made him tense, each footstep or distant shout causing his heart to race. He realized then how vulnerable he felt, a feeling so foreign it was almost paralyzing. Eventually, exhaustion overcame fear, and he drifted into a fitful sleep, waking at every sound, each rustle of wind. It was a night of firsts, his first night without a roof over his head. The first night he could remember where he felt scared of the dark, and the first night he truly understood the difference between choosing to sleep outside and having no other option. As dawn broke, Charles got up, stiff and colder than he'd ever been. The city was waking up, indifferent to his discomfort. He packed up his sleeping bag, his body aching from the hard ground, his spirit dampened by the reality of his challenge. The romanticism of his undertaking had completely dissolved, replaced by the harsh truth of his vulnerability and the daunting week ahead. Charles shuffled his way back to the busier streets as the city hustled into morning routine. He spotted a small soup kitchen line forming down a narrow alley, the kind of place he had only ever read about. His stomach growled, reminding him of his new reality. As he approached, he noticed the orderly yet weary line of people, each face telling a story of hardship. He took his place at the end of the line, feeling out of place and yet invisible. Everyone seemed absorbed in their own thoughts, conserving energy, perhaps, or lost in memories of better times. As he inched forward, he focused on the steam wafting from the kitchen, carrying the scent of something hearty. It was there he first saw Emily. She was handing out bowls with a smile, her eyes meeting those of each person as if seeing them truly. When Charles reached the front, their eyes met briefly. "Here you go," she said, offering him a bowl of soup and a piece of bread. Her gaze was kind but quick to shift. She was here to help, not to judge. "Thank you," Charles muttered, his voice rougher than he intended. He found a spot on a nearby bench, the warmth of the soup a small comfort against the chill. Emily's presence lingered in his mind, her genuine smile, the ease with which she offered kindness. It was a stark contrast to the world he knew. After finishing his meal, he watched her interact with others, her warmth unflagging. Gathering his courage, he approached her again, hoping to learn more about survival from someone clearly respected here. "Excuse me?" he began tentatively. "I'm new to all this. Any advice?" Emily looked at him, perhaps seeing him for the first time. "Stick to places like these for meals," she advised, "and keep your belongings close at night. It's not easy, but you're not alone." Her words, simple yet sincere, made him feel slightly less adrift. Encouraged by Emily's kindness, Charles decided to shadow her for the day, hoping to learn more about navigating this new world. She seemed hesitant at first, but agreed, perhaps sensing his genuine need for guidance. They walked through the city, Emily pointing out safe places to sleep, where to find clean water, and which public facilities were the most accommodating. Charles was struck by the complexity of her knowledge, information that was vital for survival, yet entirely absent from his previous life. As they moved through the city, Emily shared stories of the people they passed. Each story added depth to his understanding of the community around him. He was particularly moved by a young man named Marcus, who had lost his job and home in quick succession, a victim of circumstances far beyond his control. The day passed, with Charles absorbing every detail, every piece of advice Emily offered. He helped her at another soup kitchen in the afternoon, serving meals and cleaning up afterward. The work was humbling, the gratitude in people's eyes a new kind of reward for him. That evening, as they parted ways, Emily gave him a small, understanding smile. "You did good today. Just remember, everyone has a story. The more you listen, the more you'll understand." Charles nodded, her words sinking in. He watched her disappear into the subway, her figure a beacon of hope in a world that had seemed so dark the night before. His perspective was shifting, slowly but irrevocably, as he realized that this challenge was no longer about winning a bet. It was about understanding a slice of humanity he had never known existed. As the week progressed, Charles found himself delving deeper into the community he once viewed from a high-rise distance. His days began at sunrise, joining the queue at various soup kitchens or community centers, each visit adding layers to his understanding of this stark reality. One afternoon, while helping to distribute clothes at a donation center, he reconnected with Emily. She seemed pleased to see him getting involved. "You're really taking this to heart," she commented as they sorted through donations together. "Yeah, it's a lot different when you're living it," Charles admitted, folding a sweater with more care than he might have thought possible a week ago. "I had no idea just how much I didn't know." Emily nodded, handing him another box. "It's easy to miss what doesn't directly affect us, but these are lives, not just stories. They matter." Their conversation was interrupted when a man approached them, desperation etched deep in his face. Emily immediately engaged him with a comforting ease, listening intently as he explained his plight of losing his shelter spot. After a moment, she turned to Charles. "Could you finish up here? I need to help him sort this out." Watching her navigate the situation with such compassion and efficiency, Charles felt a pang of admiration mixed with a sobering dose of reality. He realized then that the challenge he had taken on was more than just an experience. It was a profound lesson in humanity. That night, Charles found a quiet corner in a bustling park to reflect. The city sounds faded into a backdrop as he pondered his journey. The physical discomforts of hunger and cold were now accompanied by a mental tapestry woven with the stories and struggles of those he had met. He thought about Emily and the man from the donation center, their faces lingering in his mind. There was a resilience in their eyes, a kind of strength that Charles felt he had never really had to muster. His previous life, filled with its superficial challenges, seemed trivial in comparison. Pulling his jacket tighter against the evening chill, Charles realized how much his perspective had shifted. The challenge was no longer about surviving the week to win a bet or to prove something to Victoria. It was about understanding a part of society he had blindly ignored. He wondered, not for the first time, if he could ever truly go back to his old life unchanged. The stars peeked through the urban glow above him, a reminder of the vastness of experiences and lives unfolding around him. He knew this week would end, but the imprint of these revelations would shape him in ways he was only beginning to grasp. As he settled into his makeshift bed, the city's cacophony a constant hum, he felt a resolve solidifying within him. This was no longer just a challenge, it was a pivotal chapter in his life, one that he was only just starting to write. The next morning brought with it a biting cold that seeped through Charles' thin clothing, making his bones ache as he woke. The discomfort was now a constant companion, but so was his growing resolve. He made his way to a community center where Emily had mentioned they needed volunteers. Today, he was more than a bystander. He felt like a part of something greater. As he helped set up for the day's meal service, he was approached by a volunteer coordinator, a middle-aged woman named Lisa, who looked as weary as she was determined. "Emily told me about you," Lisa said, her voice laced with a hint of skepticism yet open curiosity. "And she says you're trying to understand what it's like for people out here." Charles nodded, his hands busy with stacking chairs. "Trying to, at least. I know a week isn't enough to really understand, but it's a start." Lisa smiled slightly, softening as she handed him a stack of plates. "Every bit of genuine effort counts. Just keep your heart open and your judgments at bay." The day was grueling but fulfilling. Charles found himself in the midst of heartfelt stories, each conversation uncovering layers of human resilience and pain. He listened, really listened, to tales of lost jobs, broken families, and battles with illnesses without the safety net of insurance. It wasn't just about survival, it was about dignity, about fighting to maintain one's humanity against all odds. As he lay down that night, under the shelter of a large bridge among others who had no home to call their own, the gravity of their plight weighed heavily on him. The challenge had intensified, not just physically but emotionally, transforming his understanding of what it meant to be homeless. It was on his final night of the challenge that everything came to a head. Charles had found a relatively safe spot to sleep, tucked away in an alley shielded from the wind. He was just about to drift off when he heard footsteps approaching. Instinctively, he tensed, his week's sharpened senses alerting him to potential danger. A shadow fell over him, and he looked up to see a figure looming. Before he could react, his backpack was snatched, his only possessions gone in an instant. Stunned, he tried to chase the thief, but quickly lost sight of them in the maze of dark streets. Breathless and defeated, he returned to his spot, the loss sinking in. It wasn't just about the items that were taken, it was the violation of the fragile security he had managed to cobble together. Sitting back against the cold wall, he felt a despair he hadn't known before. Just then, footsteps approached again. He braced himself, expecting the worst, but looked up to see Emily standing there, concern etching her features. "I heard what happened," she said, kneeling beside him. "I came as soon as I could." Charles was at a loss for words. The gesture, the concern in her eyes, it was all overwhelming. Why was all he could manage. "Because," Emily replied, her voice firm yet gentle. "Out here we look out for each other. You're not alone, Charles. Not really. Not unless you choose to be." Her words, simple yet profound, struck a chord within him. As they sat there, the city's noises around them, Charles realized how much this experience had changed him. He had come into this challenge seeking to understand a world he had never known. And now, faced with the raw reality of it, he found himself irrevocably transformed. The night faded into the early hues of dawn, marking the end of his week on the streets. But the journey was far from over. The real challenge was just beginning. How to take this newfound understanding back to his world, how to make a real difference. As the first light of dawn broke over the city skyline, Charles found himself at a crossroads. The physical discomforts of the week, hunger, cold, fear, had been harrowing, but they paled in comparison to the emotional and mental revelations he had experienced. Walking back to his high-rise apartment felt surreal, each step weighed down by the profound disconnect between his two worlds. Upon his return, Victoria greeted him with a cautious optimism. "You look different," she remarked, scanning his tired eyes and worn-out appearance. Charles merely nodded, his mind swirling with thoughts. "I need to do something meaningful with this," Charles said, more to himself than to Victoria. He spent the day resting, but his thoughts were restless, grappling with how to translate his street-level insights into actionable change. The next day, Charles returned to the community center where he had volunteered. He was met with mixed reactions, some wary, others curious. Emily, however, greeted him with a warm smile that put him at ease. "I wasn't sure if you'd come back," she admitted, as they prepared food for the day's service. "And I had to," Charles responded sincerely. "There's a lot I need to learn, and perhaps a lot I need to fix." Working alongside Emily and other volunteers, Charles began the slow process of rebuilding trust, proving his intentions through consistent, humble actions. He listened more than he spoke, absorbed everything, and offered help wherever needed. Over the following weeks, Charles became a regular at the center, his presence gradually accepted, if still slightly scrutinized. His conversations with the community deepened, moving beyond mere pleasantries to meaningful discussions about their needs and dreams. One particularly impactful conversation occurred with Marcus, the young man he'd briefly met during his week on the streets. They sat together during a quiet moment at the center, a chessboard between them. "You asked me once about my story," Marcus began, his voice hesitant. "I lost more than a job and a home. I lost my sense of worth." Charles listened intently, his previous notions of charity and help evolving with each word Marcus shared. It wasn't just about providing resources, it was about restoring dignity and hope. Motivated by these conversations, Charles initiated a project with the center to offer job training sessions. He used his contacts to bring in professionals willing to teach skills that could help people find employment. The project was met with enthusiasm, and Charles worked tirelessly, ensuring it was shaped by the community's input and needs. Through these initiatives, Charles not only deepened his understanding, but also his connections with the people he now viewed not just as beneficiaries of his charity, but as partners in a shared mission to improve lives. As Charles grew more involved in the community center's activities, his efforts began to attract attention, not all of it welcome. One afternoon, while organizing supplies in the storage room, he stumbled upon a stack of folders marked "Confidential." Curiosity piqued, he flipped through them, discovering detailed plans for a redevelopment project that would effectively demolish several local low-income housing units, including the one housing the community center. The revelation hit him like a physical blow. How could his own company, Eastern Technologies, be involved in something so destructive to the community he had come to respect and care for? The project plans bore his company's logo alongside a major real estate developer's, a stark representation of the conflict he now faced. Charles confronted the center's director, a stern yet fair woman named Judith, about the plans. Her expression hardened. "We were going to fight it," she admitted, "but we didn't know how to tell you, given your background." Feeling both betrayed by his company and responsible to help, Charles promised Judith he would do everything in his power to halt the project. The weight of his double life was never heavier and the path forward never murkier. Later that evening, Charles met with Emily in a quiet corner of the center, the folder containing the redevelopment plans lying heavily between them. He explained his discovery and his company's involvement, watching her face for signs of anger or disappointment. To his relief, Emily's reaction was one of measured concern rather than condemnation. "Charles, this is big, but it's also an opportunity for you to use your position to effect real change." Her words, though encouraging, set a daunting task before him. How could he, a single individual within a corporate giant, turn the tide against such a powerful force? Determined, Charles initiated a series of covert actions. He reached out to his contacts within the company, gathering information and building a case against the redevelopment. He also met with local government representatives, leveraging his social and financial capital to advocate for the community's interests. Simultaneously, the conflict within him grew. Balancing his CEO persona with his newfound advocacy role was exhausting and isolating. He began to feel the strain on both his personal and professional relationships, his secret actions at odds with his public responsibilities. The chapter closes with Charles at a late-night meeting with a city councillor, pitching passionately for a halt to the redevelopment. His dual life was unsustainable, and something had to give, but he was committed to fighting until the end, whatever the personal cost. Charles's involvement with the community and his covert efforts against the redevelopment project continued to deepen. He organized a series of town hall meetings to give the community a voice, inviting city officials to hear directly from the residents about how the proposed redevelopment would affect their lives. During one poignant meeting, an elderly woman stood up, her voice trembling but clear. "This center is more than just a building to us," she said, locking eyes with the city planner. "It's where we come to feel safe, to learn, and to support each other. You're taking away our home, our sanctuary." Charles watched as the room nodded in agreement, the emotional weight of her words palpable. It was moments like these that reshaped his understanding of leadership and responsibility. He wasn't just a CEO, he was a community advocate, a role he now embraced with fervor. After the meeting, Emily approached him, a small smile playing on her lips. "You're really making a difference, Charles. I can see them starting to trust you, to see you as one of their own." Her approval warmed him, reinforcing his resolve. He knew he was changing, not just in how he saw the world, but in how he interacted with it. His previous life of boardroom battles seemed increasingly distant, less relevant to the person he was becoming. As Charles's efforts gained traction, the stakes grew higher. The real estate developer behind the project became aware of his activities and was not pleased. One chilly evening, Charles received a call from the developer, his tone icy and threatening. "You're playing a dangerous game, Easton," the developer warned. "You stand to lose more than just this deal if you continue interfering." Undeterred, Charles responded with calm determination. "This isn't just about business. It's about people's lives, something you seem to have forgotten." The threat loomed large, but so did his commitment to the cause. Charles knew he couldn't back down now, not when so many depended on him. He doubled down on his efforts, working late into the nights, researching legal avenues, and rallying support from influential allies. The community rallied around him, their shared struggle forging bonds stronger than the bricks of the buildings they sought to save. They organized protests and media campaigns, drawing public attention to the plight of the neighborhood. Charles was at the forefront, leading marches and speaking at rallies, his presence a powerful symbol of the unity between corporate influence and community resilience. The chapter concludes with Charles and Emily standing together at a large rally, the crowd echoing their chants. For the first time, Charles felt truly part of something greater than himself, a movement not just for the community but with the community. As the conflict intensified, Charles found himself increasingly isolated within his own company. His advocacy against the redevelopment project began to strain his relationships with the board of directors, many of whom were invested in the project's financial success. At a heated board meeting, Charles stood firm against a barrage of criticisms. "You need to remember your duties as CEO," one board member admonished, his voice echoing in the tense room. "Your personal crusades are putting this company at risk." Charles responded with controlled intensity. This isn't just a personal crusade, it's about ethical leadership and corporate responsibility. We have a duty to consider the impact of our actions on the community. His stance did not win him many allies within the boardroom, but it solidified his resolve to stand up for what he believed was right. After the meeting, as he walked through the silent corridors of his corporate office, the weight of potential consequences bore down on him. Yet, the thought of backing down never crossed his mind. Later that day, Emily met him to discuss the next steps. "You're risking a lot for this, Charles. Are you sure it's worth it?" she asked. Concern etching her features, Charles looked out over the city, the skyline a stark reminder of the world he was fighting for. "More than ever," he replied. "Sometimes doing the right thing means standing alone." The battle against the redevelopment project reached a critical point when a pivotal city council vote was scheduled to decide its fate. Charles and the community prepared for a final stand, organizing a large demonstration outside City Hall on the day of the vote. The night before the council meeting, Charles couldn't sleep. He roamed his luxurious apartment. The trappings of his wealth starkly contrasted with the humble homes he was fighting to save. His mind raced with strategies and contingencies, the enormity of the upcoming day weighing heavily on him. The morning of the vote, the air was charged with tension and determination as protesters gathered, their signs a mosaic of defiance and hope. Charles joined Emily and other community leaders at the forefront, leading chants and rallying the crowd. Inside City Hall, the council chambers were a battleground of rhetoric and persuasion. Charles had secured a spot to speak, and when his turn came, he delivered a passionate plea, not just for the preservation of the housing, but for the soul of the city. "As a businessman, I understand the importance of development," Charles addressed the council. "But as a citizen and a human being, I implore you to consider the human cost. We must prioritize people over profit." The council listened, their faces a mix of skepticism and contemplation. After hours of debate and testimonies, the vote was finally called. The tension in the room was palpable as each council member cast their vote. The chapter closes with Charles, Truss, Emily, and the community waiting in suspended anticipation, the future of their neighborhood hanging in the balance. The room fell silent as the final votes were tallied. Charles, standing beside Emily and other community members, held his breath. The council chairperson paused dramatically before announcing, "The motion to halt the redevelopment project is passed." Cheers erupted in the council chambers, and a wave of relief swept through Charles. They had won, at least for now. Outside, the crowd's jubilation was palpable. Charles addressed the gathered supporters, his voice echoing through the speakers. "Today, we proved that when a community stands together, change is possible. Thank you for trusting me, for fighting alongside me, and for believing that we could make a difference." As the celebrations continued, Emily pulled Charles aside. "You did it," she said, her eyes bright with tears of joy. "You really did it." Charles smiled, feeling a profound sense of accomplishment, but also the weight of future responsibilities. "We did it together," he corrected gently, knowing that the journey ahead would require even more cooperation and dedication. In the weeks following the council's decision, Charles found himself at a personal and professional crossroads. His actions had created a rift within his company, and several board members were openly discussing his suitability to continue as CEO. Despite the external pressures, Charles felt a deep, unwavering conviction that he had made the right choices. One evening, while walking through the neighborhood he had helped save, Charles reflected on his transformation. The streets that once felt alien were now familiar, and the faces he passed greeted him with respect and gratitude. The experience had changed him, not just as a businessman, but as a person. Realizing that his future at Eastern Technologies might be limited, Charles began to envision a new path. He started laying the groundwork for a foundation focused on urban development that prioritized community impact over profit. He discussed the idea with Emily, who was enthusiastic about the potential to continue their work on a larger scale. As Charles prepared to face the board for a decisive meeting, he knew that regardless of the outcome, his future was irrevocably tied to the people and the causes he had come to champion. He was ready to defend his actions and, if necessary, step away to pursue his new vision. The chapter concludes with Charles entering the boardroom, ready to argue for a new direction for Eastern Technologies, or to step down and dedicate his efforts to his new foundation. The battle had been won, but the war for his soul and for the soul of the city was just beginning. As Charles entered the boardroom, the tension was palpable. Each member of the board had already taken their seats, their expressions ranging from curious to coldly antagonistic. Charles stood at the head of the table, his posture calm yet assertive. "I've called this meeting to discuss the future direction of Eastern Technologies," Charles began, his voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in his stomach. "Our involvement in the redevelopment project has shown me that our company's impact extends beyond the tech sector. It touches lives in very real, very profound ways." A murmur went through the room as Charles unveiled his proposal for shifting company resources towards more sustainable, community-focused projects. He cited the recent victory at City Hall as a catalyst for this shift, emphasizing the positive public response and the potential for brand enhancement. The board's reaction was mixed. Some members nodded in agreement, seeing the wisdom in aligning the company with more socially responsible ventures. Others were clearly skeptical, concerned about the financial implications of such a shift. The meeting stretched on, with Charles passionately defending his vision against a barrage of questions and criticisms. As the debate reached its peak, he delivered a compelling final statement. "We have a chance to redefine what success means for Eastern Technologies. Let's lead not just in innovation, but in integrity." Following the board meeting, Charles felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. While the board had not fully committed to his new vision, they had agreed to a pilot project to explore his proposals further. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Energized by this progress, Charles met with Emily and other community leaders to outline the next steps. Together, they formed a task force to oversee the pilot project, which would focus on developing affordable tech solutions for low-income neighborhoods. The plan was ambitious, involving partnerships with local governments and non-profits to ensure that the technology developed was both accessible and truly beneficial to the communities it aimed to serve. Charles worked tirelessly, drawing on all his resources and connections to bring the project to life. As the project took shape, Charles found himself more involved in the day-to-day life of the community than ever before. He attended planning meetings, participated in community forums, and even helped with the installation of new tech systems in community centers and schools. The pilot project quickly began to show positive results. The new technology, ranging from affordable internet access to community-based health monitoring systems, was making a tangible difference in people's lives. Media outlets picked up the story, highlighting Eastern Technologies' role in championing community-focused tech innovation. The public response was overwhelmingly positive, further bolstering the project's visibility and viability. Seeing the success of the pilot, more board members started to come around to Charles's way of thinking. The company's public image was at an all-time high, and even the most skeptical board members could not ignore the benefits of Charles's community-centric approach. Amid this success, Charles and Emily's relationship deepened. They found themselves not just partners in advocacy, but in life, their shared experiences binding them in ways neither had anticipated. The culmination of months of hard work came when Charles and his team were invited to showcase their community tech project at a major national technology conference. It was a moment of immense pride and potential, a chance to put their achievements on a national stage. Charles delivered the keynote address, speaking not just as the CEO of Eastern Technologies, but as a community advocate. He shared the stage with Emily and other team members, presenting case studies and testimonials from the communities that had benefited from their work. The presentation was a resounding success, met with standing ovations and extensive media coverage. Major investors and other tech companies expressed interest in supporting or replicating the project in other cities, signaling a potential nationwide expansion. In the aftermath of the conference, Charles felt a profound sense of accomplishment, but also a new weight of responsibility. The project had grown beyond his initial vision, becoming a potential model for corporate responsibility in the tech industry. However, with this success came new challenges. Managing the expansion of the project, safeguarding its core values, and balancing his responsibilities as CEO with his commitments to the community, all these factors weighed heavily on Charles. Yet, as he discussed these challenges with Emily one evening, looking out over the city that had taught him so much, he felt ready to face whatever came next. Together, they planned for the future, determined to ensure that their efforts continued to benefit those who needed them most. As the project expanded, unexpected challenges arose. Regulatory hurdles, logistical complications, and the sheer scale of the implementation required constant attention and adaptation. Charles found himself navigating a complex maze of stakeholder interests, regulatory requirements, and logistical challenges. But with each obstacle, he adapted and learned, driven by the knowledge that their work was making a difference. Through all these challenges, the community stood with him, offering support, feedback, and encouragement. Their involvement was crucial, keeping the project grounded and focused on its original goals. The chapter closes with Charles and Emily hosting a community celebration to mark the first anniversary of the pilot project's launch. The event was filled with stories of how the technology had changed lives, reinforcing the value of their work and reinvigorating their commitment to continue despite the challenges. Despite the broad success and positive impact of the community tech project, Charles faced increasing pressures from certain board members and stakeholders who were skeptical about the financial sustainability of his new direction. During a particularly contentious board meeting, a group of investors presented Charles with an ultimatum: scale back the community projects or face a vote of no confidence. The tension in the room was palpable as Charles stood, absorbing the gravity of the situation. He had poured his heart into reshaping the company's mission to serve a greater good, and now it was all at risk. That night, alone in his office, he grappled with doubt and fear, wondering if his vision for a better future was just a dream. He reached out to Emily for support, who reminded him of all the lives they had touched and changed. "Don't lose sight of why you started this," she urged him. "It's always darkest before the dawn, Charles. We're doing something important." Bolstered by her words, Charles prepared for the biggest fight of his professional life, determined to defend his projects and his position. The day of the decisive board meeting arrived. Charles entered the boardroom with a clear vision and a firm resolve to not just defend his projects, but to advocate for a fundamental shift in how the business world values success and responsibility. He presented a comprehensive report detailing the success of the community projects, complete with data on community improvement, testimonials from project beneficiaries, and an analysis showing potential long-term financial benefits from positive brand recognition and loyalty. He proposed an innovative funding model that could balance social impact with profitability. As Charles spoke, he could see the shift in perception among some of the board members. His passionate defense and the compelling evidence he presented slowly won over several skeptics. The debate that followed was intense, with both sides presenting strong arguments. In a nail-biting conclusion, the vote was cast. By a slim margin, the board decided to continue support for Charles's initiatives. Relief and triumph washed over Charles as he realized that his conviction and hard work had paid off. In the weeks following the board meeting, Charles worked tirelessly to implement the new funding model he had proposed. The success of the community projects continued to grow, and as more data emerged about their positive impact, even his staunchest critics began to see the value of his approach. The company culture gradually transformed, with more employees volunteering for community initiatives and expressing pride in the company's new direction. Charles's leadership was now defined not just by his business acumen, but by his commitment to social responsibility. A major media outlet picked up the story, and Charles was invited to speak about his company's transformation at a global business summit. His presentation was met with widespread acclaim, inspiring other corporations to consider similar approaches. As Charles reflected on his journey, he realized how much he had changed. He had started as a CEO, focused solely on profits and market dominance. But his experiences had taught him that true leadership involves a deeper sense of purpose and responsibility. Under his leadership, Eastern Technologies became a pioneer in the field, proving that integrating social responsibility into business strategy can lead to sustainable success. Charles's relationship with Emily flourished, grounded in shared values and mutual respect, and together they continued to drive change. The series concludes with Charles revisiting the community center where it all began. He watched as children learned to code on computers provided by his company, a tangible symbol of the positive impact of his work. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, but he faced them with confidence, supported by a community that he now called family. If you enjoyed, consider subscribing to our channel and supporting us through the thanks button.